And I think probably, you know, we might disagree on this. I think it's a little bit more historically complex than Trotskyists engage in demonization and others don't. You know, actually, you've got in the West a few interesting organizations that come from a Trotskyist background. For example, Workers' World or PSL in the US, or the Trotskyist platform in Australia, which have really good positions in relation to China, and they even have really good positions in relation to defending the DPRK or defending Syria. And meanwhile, you've got some organizations that come from a Stalinist or a Hoxhaist tradition that can take objectively reactionary positions. So there's some kind of subtleties there that we can get into another time. But as to why this happens and why the left participates in class war on the side of the enemy, there's a few aspects to it. One is that, you know, this hate propaganda, this slander, is so powerful, it's so pervasive, that it makes it very difficult to reject. Like at the level of social psychology, it's difficult to find yourself in a tiny minority. You know, I feel that, you know, that if I say something, if I defend China over its record in Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong, I know I'm going to be subjected to a certain amount of abuse. And it's tough to deal with that. And I'll be considered by some people as not a good person, right? As like we talked about before, you can be labeled a genocide denier. Who wants to be a genocide denier? I'm trying to stick up for the global working class. I'm trying to stick up for socialism. I'm trying to stick up for the anti-imperialist movement. I didn't do that so that people can start slandering me and calling me a genocide denier. So it's really difficult to be in that kind of tiny minority facing this juggernaut of very powerful propaganda. You know, people have come to believe that China is a force for evil, so they don't want to be associated with it. They think it makes them look bad. They think it makes the idea of socialism look bad. Aside from that, I think people are very stuck on specific notions of what freedom is and what democracy is. And without necessarily consciously having this understanding, thinking that what we have in the West, capitalist, kind of liberal democracy, is the perfect system for running a society, even though we know perfectly well it isn't, even though, you know, we've all read Lenin's State and Revolution, and we all understand the limitations of capitalist democracy, and we understand that what we really live in is a plutocracy where power is determined by money. Even though we understand that our precious freedom of speech occurs within a very, very kind of narrow, this tiny band, we still look at China and say, well, that society is bad because it doesn't have human rights and it doesn't have democracy. Actually, you know, China simply has a different conception of human rights that prioritizes basic rights first, right? That's prioritized ending poverty, that's prioritized ensuring everybody has food and shelter and clothing and education and healthcare and running water and modern energy. And they've been incredibly successful with that. And that's why the Chinese government is extremely popular in China. And you look at poverty in Britain or in France or in the United States, and you wish they'd take a few lessons, read a few pages out of the Chinese book. And meanwhile, China also has its own form of democracy. It's socialist democracy, which is actually in many ways a lot more participatory than the form of democracy that we're used to in the West, which essentially means every 4 or 5 years you get to vote for 1 or 2 individuals or 1 out of 2 parties that all of them represent capitalism, all of them represent imperialism. So the best you possibly get is the so-called lesser evil, right? So I think a lot of people in the West are just stuck with these lazy Eurocentric conceptions that prevent us from seeing what's positive in China. And then, people on the left criticize the Chinese state because it's repressive. Well, yeah, the Chinese state is repressive, but all states are repressive, right? That's literally, that's the definition of a state. The Chinese state is set up to protect a social and economic system that has served the Chinese people extremely well for the last 72 years, a system that's relied on socialist democracy. And that's why China's been able to achieve what it achieves. That's why it's been able to wipe out poverty and enact land reform, and why living conditions for ordinary people have improved constantly since 1949 because of the Chinese system. And so the Chinese state protects that system from numerous internal and external forces, mainly Western imperialist powers, that want to disrupt it. Actually, we've got, in the West, on the left, we've got some agency there. We could get involved here, because if we want the Chinese state to be less repressive, then the responsibility is on us to stop our states from trying to interfere in China and to change its political system, right? That's on us. We can exercise a bit of control here if we think that China would be so much better if the Communist Party government was less repressive. Well, it's repressive because it needs to be repressive, because it needs to protect socialism from the forces of imperialism. We're here, we're in the imperialist country, so let's do something about that. Aside from that, I think there are some cultural differences with China specifically. For example, you have some sections of the Western left who find it easier to support Cuba and Venezuela than to support China. Even some people will find it easier to support Vietnam than would find it easy to support China. And I think a lot of that, even though China and Vietnam have got essentially the exact same political and economic system, right? I think a lot of that is down to cultural differences, and the fact that China and Korea also are really not Europeanized at all. They don't adopt Western philosophies. They weren't colonized in the way that Cuba was, in the way that Vietnam was. And they continue to be essentially Asian, and to have their own outlook that is difficult for Europeans or Europeanized people to understand. And that on the left, you would kind of think that we would make an effort to try and understand, and yet a lot of people don't. So those cultural differences, I think, get in the way of the Western left really engaging with what Chinese socialism or what Korean socialism is about and what it looks like in reality, and to focus more on learning from that rather than trying to project our dogmas and our ideals of what socialism should be onto other people. So yes, there are lots of people in the Western left that go along with the propaganda war on China. There are lots of reasons. None of them, I think, are very good reasons. But there you go. That's part of the work that people like you and I and others that we work with have to do, is to try and change that situation where you've got significant portions of the Western left participating in the Cold War on China, participating in the propaganda war, and as I put it earlier, engaging in a global class struggle on the side of the imperialist bourgeoisie.